Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Jervis Forum, Frontiers of International Security. I'm Joe Parent at the University of Notre Dame. Today, we're lucky to be joined by Lindsey O'Rourke, who's a professor at Boston College. Lindsey, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
All right, today we're going to be talking about spheres, spheres of influence, maybe other spheres. Lindsey, tell me what a sphere is and why people should care about it.
A sphere of influence is a geographic region where one dominant state exerts primary control over the foreign policy and economic orientations of smaller states. So think the United States and the Western Hemisphere. Um, and I think everybody should be interested in it because it's incredibly relevant to great power politics. Some of the biggest foreign policy disputes right now over, say, Ukraine and Taiwan, I think are competitions over spheres. So we need to have a good theory about it.
Okay, and how do spheres differ from empire or hegemony or related terms like that?
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult because it is a very muddy concept, and there's it's used slightly different by different paradigms throughout IR. Um, for me, I tried to separate it out from, say, an empire in that spheres of influence, the states within it, they retain sovereignty, and the dominant power, although it influences the foreign policy orientation, its reach doesn't go as deep into the domestic politics of the subordinate state, typically. Obviously some spheres are more coercive than others, but I tried to I loosen the definition a little bit. So it's that I separate it in my study from colonial empires and from straight up empire by this definition.
Okay, can you give us a quick stylized history of the study of spheres?
Ooh, that's a great question. It's actually very interesting. So the term itself, emerged in the late 1800s in sort of realpolitik conversations between European diplomats. It's mentioned in all sorts of studies. If you look at like the a lot of like geostrategic thoughts and the interwar period and stuff, there's people talking about spheres of influence concepts. There's people like Neumann, Schmidt, and stuff who developed theories of it. But surprisingly, it doesn't really get that much traction in the direct IR literature. If you look, even though it's often considered kind of the quintessential realist concept, a lot of the canonical works within realism don't mention spheres. Waltz doesn't talk about it, Mearsheimer doesn't talk about it, Carr, Morgenthau. Um, so it's kind of this concept that's been around for a long time that people use the term, but I don't think there has been as much systematic interest in it until really kind of the last 10 years, I think.
What happened?
I think the war in Ukraine was one of the big things. The idea that Russia wanted the sphere of influence. I think conversations about the future of Taiwan, people started to realize that this was an important topic. And then, even with the last administration or the Trump administration, they have started talking more openly in terms of spheres. And I think that's, generated some interest in the concept as well. I think just this idea that we're moving back to the era of great power politics, and there's this term out there that's important, makes people want to look at it.
Awesome. All right, and tell us about your work. What have you learned about spheres?
That's a big question. Well, I'm
It's
just
also a big book. You should all buy it.
not out yet. It's a very long book so far. It's a so I've done the study. I look at all of the great power competitions over spheres since 1815. And what I found is actually very interesting. So my first big observation is that spheres are just sort of this enduring factor of international relations. I present this realist theory, arguing why they come out of just the nature of anarchy in the international system, that states want spheres, and then I talk about the various political, economic, and political and military benefits of it. But my take-home point is that, states with spheres are stronger, safer, and wealthier than those without them, which is why every great power since 1815 has tried to create its own sphere. So then I look at, is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? And it's actually kind of interesting. So on the one hand, while I do find that spheres are power maximizing and security maximizing for their dominant states, the question of whether the pursuit of a sphere and whether you should make deals over spheres serves your interest is kind of surprising. So on the one hand, I think the common picture of spheres is that they're this incredibly destabilizing sort of recipe for disaster that states that want spheres like Germany or Japan in World War II up in the system, which is undeniably true. That's all true. But there's also this undercurrent that I came throughout all of my case studies is that at various points in history, great powers have gotten together and they've made these deals over spheres that have actually been a source of stability and peace in the international system. So, for instance, the Concert of Europe, which kept the peace in Europe for almost all of the 19th century, was very much an explicit spheres deal, where the great powers got together and they literally carved out the map and made spheres amongst themselves. And this actually served as a positive stabilizing force. You could argue, the Cold War division of Europe into Soviet and American spheres is arguably the biggest factor that kept the Cold War cold. And so sometimes they're peaceful, sometimes they're a source of conflict. And so my book tries to explain this puzzle
Excellent. All right. So what's the next generation going to teach us?
of people looking into spheres.
Yes.
Oh, there's so many questions left unanswered. So there's a ton of research. I think, working out the internal dynamics of how great powers maintain their spheres is something that, I touch on in the book, but there's really a lot of work to be done there, working out sort of the dynamics of this type of order. I think there's some great foreign policy questions. Just should we be making a spheres deal with China where we, trade Taiwan for them not intervening in the Western Hemisphere? How is the Ukraine war going to end? Is it going to be a spheres deal with Russia? There's all sorts of questions out there that I think are fascinating, and ripe for the picking because, as I said, it's been a bit of a theoretical void until fairly recently. So, good area to go into.
Awesome. Well, thank you for laying the groundwork for that. Lindsey O'Rourke, thanks so much for coming on. Great to have you.
Of course, thank you for having
And
me.
thank you, everybody, for tuning in Frontiers of International Security.